We start this hour in the United States, where the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency says it will halt collections of tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The move comes more than 3 days after the U.S. Supreme Court declared the duties illegal. CBP says it will deactivate all tariff codes linked to Donald Trump's IEEPA orders. However, the halt coincides with a new 15% global tariff imposed under a different legal authority. The agency has not explained the delay in stopping collections, nor clarified whether importers will receive refunds. Meanwhile, other tariffs under Section 232 and Section 301 remain in place. Joining us now to discuss Donald Trump's tariff situation is Mitali Nikore, an economist joining us live from New Delhi. Thank you so much for joining us. These tariffs generated nearly $500 million a day, according to some estimates, and a $175 billion figure collected in total. What foot does this put Donald Trump on currently? And what's your assessment on his new legal framework for this blanket 15% term, which he has imposed since the previous one was struck down?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Thomas, for having me on the show. I think, honestly, when we look at this situation, it's just a very confusing situation for several exporters, particularly from the global south, because if you look at the global south perspective, they should not be required to pay any additional tariffs. And in fact, the US should now be required to provide 100% refund as well as pay damages to the exporters from the global south. A lot of American entities have already started filing lawsuits with the government of the US, suing the government in many cases, suing some of the export agencies. And at the end of the day, this is going to create a flurry of lawsuits and legal activity across the world as this confusion continues on on the refunds, on whether these refunds are entitled for the period when the tariff was applied. And of course, the 15% rate is meant to make up for this $500 million figure which you spoke about. In sum, around $175 billion of tariffs have been collected by the US in the period in which the tariffs were applied, and it is hoped that this 15% will help the administration recoup and also be able to help in refunds. But honestly, there is just complete confusion across the world right now.
Indeed. And Mitali, what does this mean for Donald Trump domestically when it comes to the economy? Donald Trump has pitched his second term on these cuts versus big spends policy, where, of course, he has seen that those huge cuts from federal agencies, but has also announced some significant spending plans when it comes to a $900 billion baseline on military spending, as well as a $2 billion a year on a global health alternative, among other spending plans, of course. What does this ruling mean now that $175 billion that was incoming additional from these tariffs has now been ruled out?
Absolutely, Thomas. And this also has very serious implications for US debt, because let's not forget that US is amongst the most indebted countries of the world. Even if that debt sits as domestic debt and not international debt, it's still a massive pile of debt that they sit on. And at last count, when I checked, the debt to GDP ratio for the US was 168%. So that's almost 1.5 times the size of their economy. That's a state of the debt of the US economy. So at the end of the day, scenario, the only way to get out of that debt is to print money. And maybe the US will be forced to do that in a few years if it does not adopt policies that actually boost revenue generation. And that can only happen not through tariffs, but rather through the investment in productive sectors of the economy by creating labor productivity. And yet we see that the US continues to disinvest from social security, from education, from health, all of which makes it much more viable for people to leave the US and settle in other countries. And we're seeing that massive expatriation towards the Gulf countries, towards UK, towards Europe, which is taking place from the US. So at this point in time, the US economy, I mean, while we are not seeing those signs today, we don't see that unemployment rate today, we don't see the growth deceleration today. But apart from AI, there are very few sectors in the US economy that are actually performing and providing returns.
Mitali Nikore, thank you so much for taking the time. We could talk about that forever, but of course we have